There are silences that last longer than they should. 17 years is one of them, and on the night Jerry Lewis walked out from behind the Tonight Show curtain in the autumn of 1973, laughing before he even reached the desk the way he always did, stumbling over nothing, catching himself on the microphone stand with an expression of profound surprise at his own clumsiness. The 300 people in that studio rose to their feet and made the kind of noise that only the truly beloved can produce in a room. Jerry soaked it in the way he always did, as though he were genuinely astonished that anyone had shown up, as though the applause were directed at someone just behind him and he was checking over his shoulder to see who it was. But what the audience did not know, what Jerry Lewis did not know, as he shook Johnny Carson's hand and sat down and began the performance of being himself that he had been perfecting since 1946, was that in the corridor behind the curtain 40 feet away, a man was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes closed, steadying himself. 17 years of silence, and in 3 minutes it was going to end. In 3 minutes, Dean Martin was going to walk through that curtain onto the Tonight Show stage, and the most famous comedy duo in American entertainment history was going to see each other for the first time since the night they both walked off a stage in New York and didn't say goodbye. Before we go there, I want to say something directly. I notice in the comments every single week that people who have been watching this channel for months did not realize they were not subscribed. If these stories reach you, if you find yourself watching past midnight unable to stop, please take 10 seconds right now and check whether you are subscribed. It is free, it costs nothing, and it is the one thing that ensures you never miss what we put out next. Thank you for being here. Now let us go back to where this begins. Because before there was a silence, there was a sound, and before there was a sound, there were two young men in a New Jersey nightclub in the summer of 1945 who looked at each other across a backstage hallway and understood, without either of them being able to explain it, that something was about to happen that neither of them could produce alone. Joseph Levitch was born in Newark, New Jersey, on March 16, 1926. He was the son of traveling vaudeville entertainers, which meant that he grew up not in a home in any conventional sense, but in the backstage corridors of theaters and clubs across the northeastern United States, watching performers from the wings while his parents were on stage, learning the precise science of making a crowd respond before he could fully read. He was not a good student in any formal academic setting. He was a catastrophic student. He was the kind of child who understood instinctively that the energy in a room could be changed by a single well-placed gesture, by a shift in timing that was almost impossible to teach because it existed at a level below conscious technique, and he could do it with his body in ways that made people who watched him feel both helpless and grateful. He had started performing professionally as a teenager, doing a record miming act in clubs and theaters under the name Jerry Lewis, a name that felt more American and more stageable than the one he had been given. By 1945, he was 20 years old, working steadily but not yet in the way he would be working in 2 years, and he had not yet met the man who would make it all possible. Dino Paul Crusetti was born in Steubenville, Ohio, on June 7, 1917. He was the son of an Italian barber, a quiet, contained, deeply interior man who presented to the world a surface of such beautiful ease that most people who knew him spent years mistaking the surface for the whole. He had worked in a steel mill, dealt cards in illegal gambling operations, and begun singing in clubs under the name Dean Martin, which sounded more like what a successful entertainer ought to be named than what his father had actually called him. By 1945, he was 28 years old, and already developing the vocal instrument and the gestural vocabulary that would eventually make him one of the most effortlessly watchable performers in the history of American popular entertainment. He was about to meet Jerry Lewis in a backstage corridor at the Glass Hat Club in New York, and neither of them had any idea what that was going to mean. The story of how they met has been told many times, with variations that depend on who is telling it and how many years have passed since the events in question. What is consistent across every version is this: they ran into each other, they began talking, and within minutes they were performing for each other in the empty backstage hallway, in a way that had nothing to do with material or craft or professional strategy, and everything to do with something rarer and more unreliable, which is the recognition of a complementary frequency. Jerry was all motion, all surface, all explosive physical energy that turned the air around him into something different. Dean was the stillness that made the motion visible. He was the straight line that gave the curve its shape. Together, they produced something that neither of them could have named or explained, but that both of them recognized immediately as the thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. And on that recognition, they built one of the most successful entertainment partnerships in the history of American show business. But what you are about to learn about what that partnership cost them, and what happened in the 17 years of silence that followed it, and what Dean Martin carried in his jacket pocket on the night he walked back through the Tonight Show curtain in 1973, has never been fully told before tonight. And it begins with the Copacabana nightclub on East 60th Street in Manhattan was, in the 1940s and early 1950s, the center of the American entertainment universe in the way that only a very few places have ever been. The talent that passed through its doors during those years constituted a kind of living catalog of who mattered most in popular culture. And the audiences who came to see that talent were some of the most discerning and well-connected in the country. When Martin and Lewis first played the Copa in the summer of 1948, they were already generating buzz that was unusual for performers as young as they were. The buzz became something louder and stranger on opening night, when the crowd's response to the act was of a different character than the enthusiasm that typically accompanied a well-received nightclub performance. It was the sound of an audience that had just seen something it couldn't entirely account for, something that went past the individual components of the performance and into a territory that was harder to describe but impossible to miss. The Copa became, over the years that followed, a kind of home base for Martin and Lewis. They returned again and again as they rose through the ranks of American entertainment, adding movies and television and radio to the nightclub work that had been their foundation, accumulating a kind of cultural gravity that made them, by the early 1950s, something that had no real precedent in the entertainment landscape. They were not simply a comedy duo, they were a phenomenon. They generated a response in audiences that had dimensions to it that went beyond what comedy alone could explain. And the reason for that was something that the audiences could feel even if they could not articulate it. What they were watching was not performance, or not only performance. It was friendship, real friendship, the kind with all its contradictions and pressures and private territories intact, visible through the cracks in the professional surface. The audience loved Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis because the audience could see that Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis genuinely loved each other. And that is why what happened on July 25, 1956 was so devastating, not just professionally, personally, for both of them, in ways that neither of them were fully able to speak about for the 17 years that followed. Wait, because what happened in those 17 years and what Dean Martin chose to carry in his jacket pocket on the night he decided to end the silence reveals something about the cost of pride and the weight of unspoken things that no biography has ever fully captured. To understand July 25, 1956, you have to understand what the years leading up to it had done to the balance of the partnership. Martin and Lewis had been together for 10 years by then. 10 years of working every room, every stage, every medium that would have them, building something that had become bigger than either of them had originally imagined it could be. The movies had been enormously successful. The television work had established them in millions of American living rooms in a way that the nightclub appearances never could have achieved alone. They were wealthy. They were famous. They were recognizable everywhere they went. And they were, by every external measure, at the peak of what they had built together. But inside the partnership, something had been shifting for a long time, and both men knew it, and neither of them had found a way to talk about it directly. The nature of their dynamic had always given Jerry the more visible comic role, and Dean the more contained straight man presence. And in the early years this had felt natural and right, and like the expression of something genuine about who both of them were. But as the years accumulated, As Jerry's reputation for comic genius grew and his ambitions as a filmmaker and performer deepened, Dean began to feel increasingly like a supporting element in a vehicle that had originally been built for two equal drivers. He was funny. He was enormously talented. He had gifts that the partnership's format was not fully using, vocal gifts in particular, and a presence and timing that was being subordinated to a structure that had stopped fully serving him. He did not say these things directly. He was Dean Martin. He said almost nothing directly about anything that mattered. He showed up. He performed. He smiled that smile that could have powered a city, and he said nothing. And the silence between what he was feeling and what he was saying grew until it had its own weight and its own momentum. And by the spring of 1956, it had become something that could not be maintained much longer without something breaking. What broke? On July 25, 1956, at the Copacabana in New York, was the partnership. Their last performance together. Their last night on a stage as Martin and Lewis. And what made it devastating, beyond the professional consequences, was how it ended. Not with a confrontation, not with an argument, not with the kind of scene that at least gives the people involved something to hold on to in the years that follow. It ended with two men walking off a stage in opposite directions and not looking back. And the silence that began that night lasted, with very few exceptions, for 17 years. What those 17 years cost both of them is something that neither man discussed publicly in any comprehensive way until much later. And even then, only in fragments. In the particular language of men who have been trained by their era to treat emotional disclosure as a kind of weakness. What is known is this. Dean Martin's solo career after the split was by any professional measure a triumph. He became one of the most successful recording artists in the country, a Rat Pack member, a Las Vegas institution, a film star of the first rank. He was, by the early 1960s, more famous and arguably more successful than he had ever been with Jerry, and none of it fully satisfied him in the particular way that the partnership had, because the partnership had given him something that no solo success could replicate, which was the experience of being in a room with someone who completed a frequency that he carried alone without knowing it. He drank. He maintained the beautiful surface with such apparent ease that almost everyone around him took the surface for the reality. He was funny and warm and professionally exact and personally unreachable. And the people who knew him best said that there was a quality in him in those years that was like a radio station that had been slightly knocked off its frequency, receiving clearly enough to function. Not quite right. Jerry Lewis's years without Dean were, if anything, more publicly complicated. He directed films of growing ambition and increasing critical division. He became an enormous star in France in a way that baffled and eventually irritated many American observers. He did serious work and foolish work and work that defied easy categorization. And he maintained the persona of Jerry Lewis, which was a kind of perpetual motion machine of energy and need and uncontainable feeling, with such consistency that it became difficult for the people around him to see when the machine was actually running on fumes. But the people who knew him, the people who had been there in the early years, said the same thing in different ways when they talked about those 17 years. There was something missing, not from the work necessarily, from him. A thing that had been present when Dean was there and was not present when Dean was gone. And neither of them was going to be the one to say so. Neither of them was going to pick up the phone, because neither of them had the language for what they would have to say if they did. That is where Johnny Carson comes in. And what Carson did, beginning in the early spring of 1973, is something that has never been fully told. Johnny Carson had been the host of The Tonight Show for 11 years by 1973. In that time, he had developed an intuition about people that went beyond what could be explained by professional skill alone. He could read a guest the way a musician reads a room, could feel where the pressure was and where the release valve was, and what kind of question would unlock something genuine in a person who had spent their entire career perfecting the art of public presentation. He had watched Martin and Lewis before the split. He had known them separately in the years after, and what he had seen in both of them, in the particular quality of a certain kind of pause in each of them when the conversation moved near certain subjects, had given him an understanding of the situation that was clearer than anything either man had said about it directly. Carson made the first call to Dean Martin in February of 1973. He called from his office at NBC in the late afternoon when Dean was at his home in Beverly Hills. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Carson did not push. He did not lobby. He asked questions and he listened, which was what he was best at. And what he heard in Dean's answers told him that the resistance was not the real thing. The resistance was the surface. The real thing, underneath, was the same thing that had been there since July 25, 1956, unchanged and unresolved, waiting. Dean said no. Carson said he understood. He called again 3 weeks later. Dean said no again. Carson called 6 more times over the following 4 months. The 7th call lasted 2 hours. At the end of the 2nd hour, Dean Martin said something that he would later describe to his daughter as the hardest thing he had said out loud in 17 years. He said, "All right, just not with a lot of preparation. If I have time to think about it, I won't do it." Carson said he would arrange everything. He told Dean exactly when to arrive, exactly where to go, exactly who to talk to. He told him that Jerry would not know until Dean walked through the curtain. He told him that he would make sure there was no pressure, no performance required, no outcome expected. He told him that he could leave whenever he needed to. Dean was quiet for a moment. Carson waited. Then Dean said, "Does he still do that thing when he comes out and bumps into the furniture?" Carson smiled and said, "Yes, actually." Dean was quiet again. Then he said, "Okay, good. At least that hasn't changed. Do not stop here." Because what happened in the 40 minutes between Dean Martin's arrival at NBC Studios and the moment he walked through that curtain is the part of this story that nobody has ever told, and it reveals something about what 17 years of silence actually looks like from the inside. Dean Martin arrived at NBC Studios in Burbank on the evening of October 17, 1973, at 4:15. Jerry Lewis's call time was 5:30. The show would tape at 6 for broadcast later that night. Fred DeCordova, The Tonight Show's producer, met Dean personally at the side entrance on the Alameda Avenue side of the building, the entrance that was used for talent and crew and not for the public. DeCordova had been told by Carson to expect Dean and to treat the situation with the same discretion he would apply to a state secret. He did. He walked Dean through the service corridor to a small green room that had been set aside specifically for this purpose, a room that was not part of the normal guest flow, that Jerry Lewis would not pass on his way to the stage. DeCordova offered Dean coffee. Dean took it. He sat down. He put the coffee on the table beside him and didn't drink it. He sat with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the wall across the room. DeCordova, who had been in television long enough to know when a room needed to be emptied, excused himself and closed the door. What Dean did in the 40 minutes that followed, alone in that green room, is not known with certainty. What is known is that when DeCordova came back at 5:45 to let him know that the show was about to begin, Dean was standing near the door rather than sitting, as though he had been moving around the room. His coffee was still untouched. He had one hand in his jacket pocket, and his fingers were closed around something. DeCordova didn't ask what it was, but he noticed the way Dean was holding it, the way you hold something that you've been carrying for a long time and are not sure yet whether you're going to give it away. The show began at 6. Jerry Lewis came out from behind the curtain in the usual way, which was to say that he came out in a manner that suggested the curtain had attacked him, that he had barely survived the encounter, and that he was surprised and somewhat suspicious to find himself on a stage in front of several hundred people. The audience loved it immediately. They always did. Jerry shook hands with Johnny, settled into the guest chair with the specific physical comedy of a man for whom sitting down was an event requiring preparation, and the interview began. Jerry was what he always was in front of an audience, which was everything, total, holding nothing back, the performer and the person indistinguishable from each other, in the particular way that is only possible for people who have been performing since childhood and have no clear memory of who they were before the performance began. Carson asked him about his current projects, about his children, about a film he was developing. Jerry answered all of it with the full force of himself, with digressions and voices and physical demonstrations and the particular kind of laughter that comes from a man who has made the world laugh for so long that he has sometimes lost track of whether his own amusement is real or performed. But there was a moment, about 22 minutes into the conversation, when Carson said something that made Jerry go still for just half a second. Not visibly, not in a way that the audience would have caught, but Carson caught it, because Carson was watching for it. He asked Jerry what he missed most about working as a duo, and Jerry's answer was immediate and practiced, and entirely true, and entirely insufficient. Which is to say that he said he missed the audience response, the specific energy that two people on a stage generate that one person cannot generate alone. And he delivered the answer with such fluency that only someone who had been watching his face very carefully would have noticed that the fluency was the point. He had answered this question many times. He had the answer ready. The answer that was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was 40 feet away, standing behind a curtain with his hand around something in his jacket pocket. Carson looked at the camera. Then he looked back at Jerry. He said, "Speaking of which," and nodded toward the curtain. And Dean Martin walked out onto the Tonight Show stage. Jerry Lewis stopped mid-breath. He did not finish the sentence he had been in the middle of. He did not turn toward the curtain immediately, because the sound of the footsteps and the sudden change in the quality of attention in the room reached him before the visual information did. And in the 1.5 seconds between the first sound and the moment he turned his head, something happened on Jerry Lewis's face that the camera caught and that nobody in the studio would forget. It was not happiness. It was not shock. It was something before both of those things, something more fundamental. The face of a man who has heard a sound he stopped expecting to hear so long ago that when it finally comes, he needs a moment to understand what it means. He turned. He saw Dean. The studio went silent. Not gradually, immediately. 90 seconds. That is how long it lasted. 90 seconds of silence on a live television program watched by millions of Americans, with no music, no announcer, no cue from the production staff about what was supposed to happen next, because what was supposed to happen next had not been scripted, because nobody in the building, including Johnny Carson, knew what was going to happen next. 90 seconds in which Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin looked at each other across the width of a television stage, and 17 years of everything that had accumulated between them was present in the room in the particular way that it is present in rooms when the people who carry it have finally stopped being able to pretend it isn't there. Dean walked toward Jerry slowly. Not the walk of a performer making an entrance, not the beautiful liquid ease that was his professional signature, the walk of a man crossing a distance that is not measured in feet. He stopped at the edge of the desk, 2 feet from where Jerry was sitting. Jerry had not moved. His hands were flat on his knees. His eyes were on Dean. His expression was the one face that Jerry Lewis never performed, the one that existed below all the others, the one that the camera had almost never caught in 27 years of his public life. It was simply his face. Dean looked at Jerry. He took one hand out of his jacket pocket. In his hand was a photograph, black and white, slightly worn at the edges, the way photographs get when they have been handled many times over many years. It showed 2 young men on a stage, a microphone stand between them, both of them laughing, the real kind, the kind that makes the eyes disappear. The Copa, 1948, their first big engagement together. Dean held it out to Jerry without saying anything. Jerry looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Dean. And Dean Martin, the man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of saying the difficult thing in a way that made it sound effortless, whose entire persona was built on the idea that nothing was worth getting worked up about, whose beautiful surface was so complete that most people had given up looking beneath it, said 5 words in a voice that was nothing like his professional voice. It was quiet and unguarded and completely his own. He said, "I should have called, kid." And Jerry Lewis, the man who had made the world laugh since the age of 5, who had no relationship with silence in any professional context, who had filled every available space in every available room with the full force of his personality since before he could remember, said nothing. He reached out and took the photograph, and then the only sound in Studio One at NBC Burbank on the evening of October 17th, 1973, was Jerry Lewis beginning to cry, not performing crying, not the comedic exaggeration of grief that was part of his repertoire, simply crying, the way people cry when something they stopped allowing themselves to want has just arrived, unexpected, 17 years late, exactly on time. Carson did not speak. Ed McMahon, who had been beside that desk for 11 years and had seen more than almost any other person in American television, had his face turned slightly away from the camera, which was as private as the cameras were going to allow him to be. The audience of 300 people sat in the silence with the complete attention of people who understand that they are witnesses to something that is not, in the most fundamental sense, any of their business, and who have decided anyway to receive it as the gift it is. Dean sat down in the chair next to Jerry. Not the chair that had been set out for a guest, the one beside the desk. He pulled a chair from the side of the stage and sat next to Jerry. Close, the way you sit next to someone when the distance between you has already been more than you can account for, and you are not willing to add any more to it. Carson leaned forward slightly in his chair. He looked at both of them. He said nothing. He was the best interviewer in the history of American television, and he understood that what was happening in front of him did not need an interviewer. It needed a witness. He was that. Jerry was still looking at the photograph. He said, "I've thought about this photograph, about this night." He stopped. Started again. "Dean, I'm sorry about how it ended. I should have said that a long time ago. I should have picked up the phone." Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told you what was happening, instead of letting you find out the way you did." Jerry shook his head. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to ask." Dean looked at his hands. "We were never very good at that part, the talking part." Jerry made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No, we were better at the other part, the showing up part. We were the best in the world at the showing up part." Dean was quiet again. Then he said, quietly, in a register that the microphone barely caught, "I missed you, Jerry. It was so simple and so direct and so entirely unlike the way Dean Martin presented himself to the world, that the people closest to the stage, the camera operators, the floor manager, the members of the production staff who had been in television for decades, described the moment afterward in identical terms. They said it was the most real thing they had ever seen on a stage." Jerry looked at Dean. He said, 17 years is a long time to miss somebody." Dean said, "Yes, it is. That is a fact." The audience did not know whether to applaud or stay silent, and so they did something between the two, which was a kind of held sound, not quite one thing or the other, that filled the studio for a moment before it resolved into the particular quiet of people who have been moved past the point where applause feels adequate. Carson finally spoke. He said, gently, to both of them, "Do you want to tell us what happened?" And both men were quiet for a moment. Then Jerry said, "We didn't know how to talk about the thing that was happening between us. We were always better at performing it." Dean said, "We should have been worse at performing and better at talking." The audience laughed. The relieved laughter of people who have been holding their breath and are grateful to be given permission to exhale. What followed in the next 63 minutes was something that the Tonight Show production staff described afterward as unlike any segment the show had produced in 11 years. Not because of what was said exactly, though what was said was honest and sometimes funny and sometimes difficult and always real, but because of what was visible in the room while it was being said. The two men sat next to each other and talked about things they had never discussed publicly, the pressures that the partnership had accumulated over 10 years, the ways in which both of them had failed to say the things that might have kept it intact, the cost of pride, the cost of silence, the particular way that time turns the unspoken things into monuments. They talked about their families. They talked about what they had each built in the years apart, And they did it with the honesty of people who no longer have anything to protect, who have passed the point where the performance is more important than the conversation. They talked about Dino Paul Crosetti and Joseph Levitch, the two young men in the backstage corridor at the Glass Hat in 1945, and what those men would think of the distance that had grown between them. Carson asked them at one point what they wished they had said to each other on the night of July 25, 1956. Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wish I had said that what we had was the best thing I was ever part of. And I wish I had asked if we could find a way to keep part of it." Jerry said, "I wish I had said I was scared of losing it, of losing you, and that I didn't know how to say I was scared because I'd been performing my way out of fear since I was 5 years old." Carson asked if they thought things might have been different if they'd had that conversation in 1956. Both men were quiet. Then Dean said, "I don't know. Maybe. But I know it's different now. We're having it now." Jerry looked at the photograph still in his hand. He said, "Do you think we could do it again?" Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do what? Some kind of act together?" Jerry said, "Yeah, something. One night. See what's still there." Dean looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I think something's still there. I've thought about it for 17 years, and I think something's still there." NBC received more calls that night than it had received for any Tonight Show broadcast in the previous 5 years. The calls came from everywhere, from people who had lost touch with someone they used to love, from former friends who had let the silence go longer than they meant to, from people who were sitting beside a telephone and trying to find the courage to pick it up and say the simple thing that had been unsaid for too long. One of the producer's assistants later said that she took a call at 11:45 that night from a man in Ohio who had not spoken to his brother in 14 years, who had been watching the broadcast alone in his kitchen, and who called NBC because he didn't know what else to do with what the broadcast had made him feel. He said he was going to call his brother in the morning. The assistant told him to call tonight. She didn't know whether he did, but she thought about it for years. The photograph stayed with Jerry Lewis. He took it with him when he left the studio that night, and he kept it in his home office for the rest of his life, on the shelf above his desk, where he could see it from his chair. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995, at the age of 78. When the news reached Jerry, he did not make a public statement for 3 days. When he finally did, it was brief, and it said everything important. He said that Dean Martin had been the other half of the best thing he had ever been part of, and that the years without him had been successful and full and missing something that no amount of success or fullness had been able to replace, and that he was grateful, endlessly and permanently grateful, for a Thursday night in October of 1973 when someone with the wisdom and the kindness to understand what the silence was costing both of them had picked up the phone and made it possible for it to end. Jerry did not name Carson in the statement. He didn't have to. Everyone who had been in that room knew what he was talking about. Johnny Carson kept the broadcast. He had it archived with particular care in the personal collection he maintained of the Tonight Show moments that he believed had done something more than entertain. He watched it again only once, years later, when he was preparing to leave the show. He sat alone in his office at NBC and watched the two men on the screen look at each other across 17 years of distance, and he thought about the specific courage it takes to end a silence that has gone on long enough to become its own kind of life. He thought about Dean's hand in his jacket pocket, closed around a photograph that he had carried for 17 years without knowing whether he would ever give it away. He thought about the moment Dean held it out. He thought about how simple it was, in the end, after everything. Just a hand held out with something in it that had been kept too long. And the other hand reaching back. That was all it was. That was all it had ever needed to be. If you have not yet joined this community, now is the moment. When you become a member of the Johnny Carson Files channel, you become part of the group of people who believe that the stories worth telling are the ones that show us how to be more honest with each other. Tap join below. It takes 30 seconds. And it means everything to the people making this. Please like this video if it stayed with you, because every like makes it possible for someone else to find it. And someone out there right now is sitting beside a 17-year silence and needs to see what happened when two men decided theirs had gone on long enough. Subscribe if you have not, so that the next story finds you when it's ready. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about a silence in your own life, one that has gone longer than it should, one that you have been meaning to end and haven't yet found the moment for. Because the moment is always the same. The moment is now. There is a person in your life who has something of yours, a frequency that only makes sense when they're in the room. You know who they are. You have been carrying a photograph in your jacket pocket for longer than you can account for. Something from the beginning, something from when it was still new, something you have kept because giving it away meant having the conversation you were not yet ready to have. You are ready. Make the call. Don't wait 17 years. Don't wait until someone else has to arrange it. Pick up the phone and say the 5 words that cost everything, and everything is this: I should have called. That's all. That's enough. Start there. See what's still there. I think you'll find something is.